1.8 million years ago, a small band of early humans took their first steps beyond the only continent our species had ever known. They carried no maps, no GPS, no survival manuals, just stone tools, strong legs, and an unshakable belief that somewhere beyond the horizon lay tomorrow. What they didn't know was that they were about to become the greatest travelers in human history, walking from the lakes of Africa to the forests of Georgia, the plains of China, and the islands of Indonesia. They would cover more ground than any human species before or since, surviving ice ages, predators, and landscapes that would challenge every fiber of their being. If you're here to fall asleep, perfect, you're in the right place. Let your mind wander with these ancient footsteps, and if you're listening from around the world, tell me your city and what time it is there. I love reading them. Tonight, we're following the greatest migration story ever told. The story of how our ancestors didn't just survive leaving home, they thrived at it. Part 1. Africa, 1.8 million years ago. Close your eyes and step into Africa, 1.8 million years ago. The continent breathes differently then, wetter, wilder, more unpredictable. Picture the East African Rift Valley, that great scar across the earth where tectonic plates slowly pull apart, creating a laboratory for life itself. Every few thousand years, the climate swings like a pendulum. Dry periods stretch for generations, turning once reliable lakes into cracked mudflats. Then the rains return with a vengeance, flooding valleys, creating new wetlands, transforming the entire food web overnight. It's like living inside a pressure cooker that someone keeps adjusting, never quite knowing if the next season will bring abundance or scarcity. In this world of constant change, our early human ancestors are learning the most important lesson of their lives. Adaptability isn't just useful, it's survival. Rick Potts from the Smithsonian calls this variability selection, and it's brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of evolving to be perfect for one environment, these early humans are evolving to be good at handling change itself. Imagine you're standing on the shores of an ancient lake in what we now call Kenya. The Turkana Basin stretches before you, a mosaic of wetlands and grasslands that shifts with each passing year. Zebras graze alongside hippos in the shallows. Buffalo move in great herds across the savanna, and everywhere, the stone tools of our ancestors tell the story of a species learning to thrive in this ever-changing world. The archaeological sites read like a prehistoric travel guide: Kubi Fora, West Turkana, Olduvai Gorge, Konso, Olorgesailie. Each location preserves a snapshot of life during these tumultuous times. At Olorgesailie, in what's now southern Kenya, archaeologists have found evidence of our ancestors butchering massive animals, elephants, hippos, giant baboons. The cut marks on these bones tell stories of cooperation, of groups working together to process enormous amounts of meat and share the bounty. But this isn't Eden, this is boot camp. Every day brings new challenges. Lions patrol the grasslands in prides twice the size of modern ones. Saber-toothed cats stalk through the forests. Giant hyenas, built like small horses, compete for every carcass. Our ancestors aren't the apex predators here, they're clever opportunists, learning when to approach a kill and when to retreat, when to stand and fight, and when to disappear into the landscape. The stone tools tell part of the story. The traditional Oldowan toolkit, simple cores and sharp flakes, continues to serve these early humans well. But around 1.76 million years ago, something remarkable happens. A new technology emerges, the Acheulean hand axe. These aren't just tools, they're works of art, symmetrical and purposeful, requiring forward planning and skilled hands to create. Think about what this means. To make an Acheulean hand axe, you need to visualize the final product before you strike the first blow. You need to understand the properties of different types of stone, the angles of force, the sequence of removals that will create the perfect cutting edge. This is abstract thinking made manifest in stone, the first clear evidence of minds that could plan not just for today, but for the journey ahead. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuate throughout the early Pleistocene, driving expansion of grasslands and contraction of forests. Open habitats mean new opportunities but also new dangers. Resources become patchier, more scattered. The groups that survive are those that can walk the farthest, plan the most carefully, and share information most effectively. By 1.8 million years ago, the stage is perfectly set. Climate change has created a species of early humans who are professional adapters, creatures who see change not as a threat, but as an opportunity. They've learned to read the landscape like a book, to anticipate where water will be found, where herds will migrate, where the best stone for tools can be quarried. Africa wasn't a paradise that our ancestors reluctantly left behind. It was a training ground that taught them everything they would need to know to survive anywhere on Earth. The restless climate, the shifting resources, the constant pressure to move and adapt, these weren't obstacles to overcome, but gifts that prepared them for the greatest journey in human history. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember this. 1.8 million years ago, our ancestors stood at the edge of the known world and chose to keep walking. They had no idea they were about to change the course of human evolution forever. Part 2. The birth of a traveler species. In the ancient lake beds of northern Kenya, something extraordinary emerges from the sediment. It's 1854, and paleontologists are carefully excavating what will become one of the most important fossils in human history, the Nariokotome boy. This nearly complete skeleton, dating to about 1.6 million years ago, tells us everything we need to know about humanity's first great travelers. Picture this young individual, probably around 8 to 12 years old when he died, already standing 5 feet 3 inches tall with the promise of reaching nearly 6 feet at maturity. His legs are long and lean, built for covering ground. His pelvis is narrow, his torso streamlined. Every bone in his body whispers the same message. This is a creature born to walk. The Nariokotome boy represents Homo erectus, though some scientists prefer calling the early African forms Homo ergaster, the working man. Whatever we call them, these early humans represent a revolution in body design. They're taller than their predecessors, with longer legs and shorter arms. Their rib cages are barrel-shaped, perfect for efficient breathing during long-distance travel. But here's what makes them truly remarkable. They're built like marathon runners, not the stocky, powerful frames of weightlifters, but the lean, efficient machines of endurance athletes. Adult Homo erectus typically stood between 4 feet 7 inches and 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighing between 90 and 143 pounds. They're not the biggest humans who ever lived, but they might be the most efficient. The endurance running hypothesis suggests that these anatomical changes weren't accidents. They were adaptations for a very specific lifestyle. Long Achilles tendons that store and release energy like springs. Enlarged gluteus maximus muscles that stabilize the torso during running. Springy foot arches that act like natural shock absorbers. Even the way their heads connect to their spines is optimized for the rhythmic bouncing motion of long-distance running. Imagine you're part of a Homo erectus group setting out across the African savanna. The sun rises behind you as you begin your daily trek, following game trails and water sources across dozens of miles. Your breathing falls into a steady rhythm. Your feet find their cadence on the ancient earth. Hour after hour, you maintain a pace that would exhaust most modern humans, but for you, this is simply how you move through the world. This isn't just about running, it's about a completely different relationship with distance. Where earlier humans might travel a few miles in a day, staying close to familiar territories, Homo erectus thinks in terms of seasons and landscapes. They're nomads by nature, following resources across vast territories, never quite settling in one place long enough to call it home. Their brains are growing too, expanding from about 550 to 1250 cubic centimeters across the span of the species. This isn't just about raw intelligence, it's about the kind of flexible thinking that long-distance travel demands. Planning routes, remembering seasonal patterns, coordinating group movements, solving problems on the fly when familiar strategies don't work. The tool technology tells the same story. While they continue using the simple Oldowan cores and flakes that served their ancestors well, Homo erectus also pioneers the Acheulean tradition. The first secure evidence comes from Kokisele 4 in Kenya and Konso in Ethiopia, both dating to around 1.76 million years ago. These hand axes and cleavers aren't just better tools, they're portable solutions designed by people who know they'll need to solve problems far from home. Think of these hand axes as the Swiss Army knives of the Pleistocene. A single tool that can butcher meat, scrape hides, dig for roots, cut wood, and dozens of other tasks. For a people constantly on the move, this kind of versatility is invaluable. You can't carry a different tool for every job when your entire toolkit needs to fit in your hands. Diet becomes crucial to understanding their success. These early humans are eating more meat and accessing more marrow and brain tissue from large animals. These are calorie-dense foods that fuel both their larger brains and their more active lifestyles. Archaeological sites across Africa show evidence of systematic butchery, with cut marks on bones revealing skilled processing of everything from small antelopes to massive elephants. The mastery of fire remains tantalizingly elusive at this early date. The most secure evidence for controlled fire comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa around 1 million years ago, microscopic ash and burned bone fragments found in their original positions. Earlier claims exist, but they remain debated. Whether Homo erectus had fire during their first migrations remains one of the great unsolved mysteries. But fire or no fire, these early humans possess something even more powerful, the ability to learn and adapt as a group. They're developing what anthropologists call cumulative culture, the ability to build knowledge across generations, to improve solutions over time, to pass complex skills from parent to child and teacher to student. As you settle into sleep, imagine the moment when this new kind of human first looked beyond the familiar horizons of Africa. They had the legs to carry them anywhere, the tools to solve problems along the way, and the minds to remember and share everything they learned. The only question wasn't whether they would leave, it was where they would go first. The traveler species had been born, now came the journey. Part 3. The First Steps Beyond Africa. 1851 kilometers northeast of the Black Sea, in the rolling hills of the Republic of Georgia, Russian paleontologist David Lord Kipernidze kneels in the red earth of Dmanisi. It's the late 1990s, and he's about to uncover evidence that will rewrite the story of human migration. Skull after skull emerges from the ancient sediments, each one carrying a message across nearly 2 million years. We made it. We left Africa, and we survived. Dmanisi isn't much to look at today, a small medieval town perched on a plateau overlooking the confluence of two rivers. But 1.85 million years ago, this was the edge of the world for our ancestors, the first chapter in humanity's greatest adventure story. Picture the scene as it unfolds in the fossil record. A small group of early humans arrives at this lakeside landscape, probably following river valleys north from the Levantine corridor. They're smaller than the classic African Homo erectus, their brains ranging from just 546 to 775 cubic centimeters, but they carry themselves with the confident stride of long-distance travelers. What's remarkable about the Dmanisi hominins isn't just that they made it so far from Africa, but how they did it. Their stone tools are simple Oldowan-style cores and flakes, nothing like the sophisticated Acheulean hand axes their African cousins were crafting. They didn't need cutting-edge technology to cross continents, they needed something much more valuable: teamwork. One of the most moving discoveries at Dmanisi is Skull 5, an older individual who had lost most of his teeth years before he died. In a world without soft foods or cooking technology, toothlessness should have been a death sentence. Yet this individual survived for years after his teeth were gone, almost certainly cared for by his group. They would have pre-chewed his food, shared the choicest morsels, made sure he wasn't left behind when the group moved on. This is cooperation in its purest form, not the calculated reciprocity of, "I'll help you if you help me," but the deep social bond that says, "We're in this together, no matter what." For travelers facing unknown dangers thousands of miles from home, this kind of solidarity wasn't just admirable, it was essential. The likely route these pioneers took follows the great river valleys that connect Africa to Asia. From the East African Rift, groups would have followed the Nile Valley northward, then moved through the Levantine Corridor, that narrow bridge of land connecting Africa to Southwest Asia. Archaeological sites like Ubaidiya in the Jordan Valley provide tantalizing glimpses of this great migration, with hominin fossils and tools dating to around 1.5 million years ago. But this wasn't a single exodus, a desperate flight from deteriorating conditions in Africa. The evidence suggests wave after wave of migration, groups following familiar patterns of seasonal movement that gradually extended their range further and further north. When climate was favorable and resources abundant, they pushed into new territories. When conditions turned harsh, they might retreat to familiar areas or hunker down and wait for better times. Think of it like ripples spreading across a pond. Each generation moves a little further from home base, testing new territories, learning new environments. Some groups turn back, others disappear entirely, their stories lost to time. But a few find that sweet spot where they can not only survive but thrive, establishing new populations that become launching points for the next wave of exploration. The landscape they encountered in Georgia would have felt both foreign and familiar. Instead of the open savannas and seasonal lakes of Africa, they found temperate forests and permanent rivers. Instead of zebras and gazelles, they hunted deer and wild cattle. But the basic principles remained the same. Find water, find game, find good stone for tools, and keep moving when resources grew scarce. The predator community at Dmanisi tells its own story of adaptation under pressure. Saber-toothed cats like Meganterion and Homotherium stalked through the forests. Giant hyenas competed for carcasses. Cave bears, wild dogs, and various big cats created a complex web of competition and danger. Our ancestors weren't moving into empty landscapes, they were inserting themselves into established ecosystems where every niche was already occupied by something bigger, stronger, or more numerous. Yet they persisted. The multiple occupation layers at Dmanisi show that groups returned to this area again and again over thousands of years. They found ways to coexist with the local predators, to exploit resources the competition had overlooked, to carve out their own ecological niche in an already crowded world. Alternative migration routes remain subjects of heated debate. Some researchers propose that early humans might have crossed from northeastern Africa into Arabia during humid periods when the Red Sea levels were lower. But geological evidence suggests that even during glacial periods, the southern Red Sea never formed a complete land bridge. The northern route through the Levant remains the most plausible pathway for these first great travelers. What emerges from the Dmanisi evidence is a picture of migration that's both more modest and more remarkable than we might have imagined. These weren't superhuman pioneers with advanced technology and detailed maps. They were small groups of early humans with basic tools, limited brains, and an extraordinary willingness to keep walking when the horizon called. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine that first group cresting a hill in what's now Georgia and seeing landscapes stretch endlessly before them, forests and rivers and mountains they had no names for, filled with creatures they'd never encountered. They had no way of knowing they were making history. They were just following their feet and their curiosity, trusting in their ability to adapt to whatever came next. The first steps beyond Africa had been taken. The world was about to become a much smaller place. Part 4. Survival on the Move. The morning sun casts long shadows across the mudflats of Illoret, Kenya, as archaeologist Matthew Bennett carefully brushes sediment from what might be the most intimate trace of human movement ever discovered. Embedded in rock that's 1.5 million years old are footprints, not the fossilized bones of our ancestors, but their actual steps, preserved in volcanic ash, like a prehistoric photograph. These aren't just any footprints. They show feet that are essentially modern, well-developed arches, a straight big toe, proportions perfectly adapted for long-distance walking. But what makes them extraordinary is that they're not alone. Multiple trackways cross the ancient landscape, suggesting groups moving together across the open ground. Here, written in stone, is evidence of the social coordination that made survival possible for our traveling ancestors. Picture yourself as part of one of these groups, setting out across the African savanna at dawn. You're not just walking, you're part of a carefully orchestrated survival system honed by thousands of generations of life on the move. Your feet find their rhythm on the sun-hardened earth, each step carrying you closer to water, to food, to the next safe place to spend the night. The persistence hunting hypothesis suggests that Homo erectus didn't just walk long distances, they ran them. Not the explosive sprint of a cheetah, but the relentless, steady pace of a marathon runner. Their anatomy tells the story. Elongated Achilles tendons that store and release energy with each stride, enlarged gluteus maximus muscles that stabilize the torso during running, specialized foot bones that turn each step into a spring-loaded launch for the next. Imagine tracking a wounded antelope across 20 miles of savanna, following its blood trail through the heat of the day. The animal is faster in short bursts, but you're more efficient over distance. Your group takes turns leading the chase, sharing the effort, coordinating the pursuit like a relay team. By evening, the exhausted animal can run no more, and your patience and endurance have won the day. But hunting was only part of the survival equation. Archaeological sites like Eurasia in Kenya reveal the sophisticated scavenging strategies that supplemented hunting success. These weren't desperate scavengers picking through lion leftovers, they were strategic operators who understood the rhythms of predator and prey across the landscape. The butchery sites tell remarkable stories of planning and cooperation. At Eurasia, archaeologists have found evidence that our ancestors were transporting raw materials from at least 17 different sources, some many miles away. This wasn't random wandering, this was systematic landscape management, groups that understood exactly where to find the best stone for tools and the most reliable sources of food and water. Your toolkit on these journeys would have been elegantly simple. Core tools and sharp flakes for the everyday work of cutting meat and scraping hides. Hand axes for the heavy-duty tasks, breaking bones to access marrow, digging for roots and tubers, processing tough plant materials. Everything designed to be portable, durable, and versatile enough to handle whatever challenges the day might bring. The social dynamics of life on the move created their own survival advantages. Groups that shared information survived better than those that didn't. Knowledge of seasonal patterns, water sources, game movements, and stone quarries became collective treasures passed from generation to generation. Children learned not just by watching but by participating, their small hands guided by patient teachers who understood that survival depended on everyone knowing their role. Food storage and sharing took on critical importance for mobile groups. High-calorie foods like bone marrow and brain tissue provided concentrated energy sources that could sustain travelers between kills. The systematic processing of large carcasses shows groups that could organize complex tasks, some individuals focused on butchery, others on tool maintenance, still others on guard duty against competing predators. Competition for carcasses was intense and dangerous. The carnivore guilds of Pleistocene Africa included creatures that would humble modern predators, lions in prides twice the size of contemporary ones, saber-toothed cats with 4-inch canines, giant hyenas built like small horses. Our ancestors succeeded not by being the strongest competitors, but by being the smartest, knowing when to approach a kill, when to retreat, and how to work together to maximize their chances. Risk management became an art form for these traveling groups. Scouts would range ahead, identifying potential campsites, water sources, and dangers. The main group would follow established routes between known safe zones, minimizing exposure to unknown threats. When conditions were uncertain, they would split into smaller units, reducing the chance that a single disaster could eliminate the entire group. The evidence from Dmanisi shows how this social safety net could sustain even the most vulnerable group members. The elderly individual who survived years without teeth didn't just benefit from occasional charity. He was part of a cultural system that recognized the value of experience and knowledge, where caring for elders was an investment in group survival. Seasonal movements likely followed complex patterns that balanced resource availability with travel costs. Groups would time their movements to coincide with animal migrations, taking advantage of river crossings where game was concentrated and vulnerable. They learned to read the subtle signs of changing seasons, the shifts in wind and weather that signaled when it was time to move on. Temporary shelters and campsites would have been chosen with care, locations that offered protection from wind and predators, access to water, and easy escape routes if danger threatened. Archaeological evidence suggests they preferred elevated locations near water sources, places where they could see potential threats approaching while maintaining access to essential resources. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine the sounds that would have surrounded our ancestors on those ancient campsites: the distant calls of hyenas, the rustle of wind through acacia trees, the quiet conversations of people planning tomorrow's journey. They slept under stars that looked exactly like the ones outside your window, dreaming dreams of horizons yet unexplored. They were writing the manual for human survival as they lived it, learning that the most powerful tool they possessed wasn't stone or fire, it was each other. Part 5. Crossing harsh environments. In the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, where today only the hardiest Bedouins venture, archaeologist Michael Petraglia kneels beside an ancient lake bed that hasn't held water for hundreds of thousands of years. The year is 2015, and he's excavating Safaka, a site that tells one of the most important stories in human prehistory: how our ancestors learned to survive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. The stone tools emerging from these sediments are Acheulean handaxes and cleavers, beautifully crafted and surprisingly well preserved. They date to at least 190,000 years ago, much later than our Homo erectus pioneers, but they illustrate a crucial principle that made the first Great Migration possible. Harsh environments aren't permanent barriers. They're temporary obstacles that patience and persistence can overcome. Imagine Arabia during one of its green periods, perhaps 700,000 years ago. What we now think of as endless desert was then a landscape of rivers and lakes, grasslands dotted with acacia trees, wetlands teeming with hippos and crocodiles. For traveling groups of early humans, these humid windows created temporary corridors across otherwise impassable terrain. The key insight from modern archaeological work is that climate change, the same force that challenged our ancestors in Africa, also created the pathways that allowed them to spread across the world. When global temperatures warmed and monsoon patterns shifted, rain fell in places that had been dry for millennia. Temporary lakes appeared, rivers flowed, and vegetation flourished. These green corridors could last for thousands of years, plenty of time for mobile populations to cross what are now some of the world's most forbidding landscapes. But crossing harsh environments required more than just waiting for good weather. It demanded a completely different approach to resource management and risk assessment. Picture a small group of Homo erectus approaching the edge of a semi-arid region during a dry period. They can see water in the distance, perhaps a seasonal lake or a river valley, but reaching it means crossing miles of exposed terrain with no guarantee of finding food or shelter along the way. The decision to proceed would have involved careful calculation. How much water could they carry? What foods would provide the most calories per unit of weight? How fast could they travel, while still conserving energy for the challenges ahead? Groups that made these calculations successfully survived. Those that didn't became cautionary tales told around distant campfires. Stone tool technology provided crucial advantages for desert travel. The Acheulean toolkit was particularly well suited for harsh environments because of its versatility and durability. A single handaxe could serve as a digging tool for finding underground water, a butchery knife for processing game, a scraper for preparing plant foods, and even a weapon for defending against predators. For people whose survival depended on traveling light, this kind of multi-purpose efficiency was invaluable. The ability to read landscape became a survival skill of the highest order. Successful groups learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated hidden resources, the types of vegetation that grew near underground water, the geological formations that sheltered game animals, the seasonal patterns that determined when and where resources would be available. River systems became highways for early human migration, providing not just water, but also the raw materials essential for tool production. Flowing water exposes fresh rock faces and concentrates high-quality stone in accessible locations. Following rivers also meant following the animals that depended on water, creating opportunities for hunting and scavenging along predictable routes. Seasonal timing became critical for groups attempting to cross marginal environments. Archaeological evidence suggests that many long-distance movements were timed to coincide with favorable weather patterns or animal migrations. Groups would wait at the edges of harsh terrain until conditions were optimal, then make rapid crossings when resources were most abundant. The social dynamics of environmental stress created both challenges and opportunities. Harsh conditions put enormous pressure on group cohesion, food was scarcer, travel was more difficult, and the margin for error was razor-thin. But they also intensified cooperation, forcing groups to share resources and information in ways that strengthened social bonds. Water management strategies would have been sophisticated for their time. Groups traveling through arid regions would need to know not just where water could be found, but how much they could safely carry, how to minimize losses during transport, and how to identify emergency sources when regular supplies failed. Archaeological evidence from later periods shows that humans developed remarkable skills in finding and conserving water in hostile environments. Food storage and preservation became crucial during long-distance travel through resource-poor areas. High-calorie foods like animal fat and dried meat could provide concentrated nutrition that was portable and relatively long-lasting. Groups that mastered these preservation techniques had significant advantages during extended journeys. The mastery of fire, while still debated for the earliest migrants, would have provided enormous advantages in harsh environments. Fire offered protection from predators, warmth during cold nights, the ability to cook tough plant foods into more digestible forms, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological comfort of light and warmth in hostile darkness. Backup strategies and contingency planning separated successful groups from those that perished in harsh environments. Experienced travelers would know multiple routes to the same destination, alternative food sources when primary targets failed, and emergency procedures when plans went wrong. This kind of redundant planning is evident in the archaeological record, where multiple tool types and varied site locations suggest groups that were prepared for different scenarios. As you drift towards sleep, imagine standing at the edge of what seems like an impossible journey, hundreds of miles of uncertain terrain stretching toward a horizon you can barely see. Our ancestors made that crossing not once but repeatedly, generation after generation, each successful journey adding to the collective knowledge that made the next attempt more likely to succeed. They learned that barriers exist to be overcome, that patient planning and determined execution can open pathways where none seemed possible. The harsh environments that should have stopped them became proving grounds that made them stronger. Part 6. Adapting to new lands. Picture the moment when a small group of early humans crests a hill in what we now call Georgia and sees their new world spread before them, rolling temperate forests where they expect open savanna, unfamiliar rivers flowing in unexpected directions, and strange animals moving through landscapes their ancestors never imagined. This is adaptation in real time, the moment when survival depends not on following ancient patterns, but on learning entirely new ones. The Dmanisi site gives us a remarkable window into this process. The lakeside environment these pioneers found would have felt partially familiar: water, woodland edges, grazing animals, but the details were all different. Instead of zebras and gazelles, they encountered ancient horses and deer. Instead of acacia and baobab trees, they found temperate hardwoods and conifers. The climate was cooler, the seasons more pronounced, the entire rhythm of life subtly but significantly changed. Dietary flexibility became their greatest asset. While meat and marrow remained central to their nutrition, the butchered bones at Dmanisi tell that familiar story. They also had to learn about entirely new plant foods. Local nuts, roots, berries, and seasonal vegetables required different processing techniques and different timing. Some foods that looked similar to familiar ones might be toxic. Others that seemed unpromising could provide crucial nutrition during lean times. Tool technology adapted to meet new challenges. While the basic Oldowan toolkit served them well, local materials required adjustments in technique. Different types of stone, fractured in different ways, demanded different knapping strategies, produced different kinds of edges. Groups that could modify their tool-making approaches to work with local raw materials had significant advantages over those that remained inflexible. The role of fire becomes even more intriguing when we consider these northern environments. While the earliest secure evidence for controlled fire comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa around 1 million years ago, the advantages fire would provide in cooler climates are obvious. Warmth during cold nights, protection from predators, the ability to extend useful daylight hours, and perhaps most importantly, the capacity to cook tough plant foods into more digestible forms. If early migrants possessed fire technology, it would have revolutionized their adaptation to new environments. Cooking could transform inedible plants into nutritious foods, tough meat into easily digestible protein, and dangerous bacterial loads into safe meals. Fire would also provide a social focus for group activities, a gathering point where information could be shared and plans could be made. The question of clothing remains tantalizingly unanswered for Homo erectus. Genetic studies of clothing lice suggest that humans began wearing clothes regularly only around 170,000 years ago, much later than the first migrations and associated with our own species rather than erectus. Yet common sense suggests that groups moving into cooler climates would need some form of thermal protection. Perhaps they relied on behavioral adaptations rather than manufactured clothing, huddling together for warmth, seeking shelter in caves or rock overhangs, using fire to create warm microclimates. Or perhaps they developed simple wraps and coverings from animal hides that haven't preserved in the archaeological record. The absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. Shelter construction likely remained simple but effective. Rock overhangs and cave mouths provided natural protection when available. In open areas, simple windbreaks constructed from branches and hides could create significantly more comfortable microclimates. The goal wouldn't be permanent architecture but portable, rapidly deployable protection that could be abandoned without regret when the group moved on. Social learning became crucial for groups adapting to unfamiliar environments. Individual trial and error learning is slow and potentially fatal when dealing with unknown foods, predators, and environmental hazards. But groups that could share information rapidly, teaching each other about local dangers and opportunities, could adapt much more quickly to new conditions. The predator communities in these new lands required entirely different strategies. At Dmanisi, the carnivore guild included saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, various bear species, and wild dogs, a different mix of competitors and threats than African environments provided. Learning the behavioral patterns of these new predators, understanding when and where they were most dangerous, figuring out how to avoid or deter them, required careful observation and shared intelligence. Seasonal patterns in temperate environments created both opportunities and challenges unknown in tropical Africa. Winter brought cold and scarcity, but also predictable animal movements and behaviors. Spring offered abundant plant foods but also increased predator activity. Summer provided the longest days and warmest temperatures, but could bring drought and increased competition for water sources. Fall offered rich harvests but demanded preparation for the lean months ahead. Water management strategies had to adapt to completely different hydrological patterns. Instead of seasonal lakes that might disappear for years, these northern environments offered permanent rivers and streams. Instead of sporadic rainfall concentrated in brief seasons, they experienced more regular precipitation spread throughout the year. Groups had to learn new ways of reading the landscape, new strategies for predicting and accessing water resources. The mobility strategies that worked so well in Africa required modification for these new environments. Dense forests restricted movement and visibility compared to open savannas. River valleys channeled travel in specific directions rather than allowing the multi-directional movement possible in more open terrain. Groups had to learn to think in terms of corridors and bottlenecks rather than the wide-open spaces their African ancestors knew. Yet the fundamental principles remained the same: stay flexible, share information, maintain group cohesion, and never become too attached to any single solution. The groups that survived the transition to new lands were those that could maintain their essential identity as adaptable travelers while learning entirely new ways of implementing that adaptability. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember that your ancestors faced the ultimate test of intelligence, not just surviving in familiar environments, but learning to thrive in places they had never seen before. They succeeded not because they were stronger or faster than the competition, but because they were better at learning, better at cooperating, and better at turning challenges into opportunities. They proved that home isn't a place, it's a set of skills you carry with you wherever you go. Part 7. Tools of Survival. In the red dirt of Kokiseli, Kenya, archaeologist Christopher Lepre carefully exposes a stone hand axe that will rewrite the timeline of human innovation. It's 2011, and the volcanic sediments surrounding this perfectly crafted tool date to 1.76 million years ago, making it among the earliest Acheulean implements ever discovered. As he lifts it from the earth, Lepre holds in his hands more than just a tool. He holds evidence of the technological revolution that made global human migration possible. Picture the moment when an early human first conceived of creating this hand axe. Unlike the simple Oldowan cores and flakes that had served for nearly 1 million years, this tool required something entirely new: the ability to envision a final product before beginning work, to plan a sequence of precise strikes that would transform a rough piece of stone into a symmetrical, functional implement. The cognitive leap this represents is staggering. To create an Acheulean hand axe, the toolmaker must hold multiple variables in mind simultaneously: the properties of the raw material, the angles and force required for each strike, the sequence of removals that will create the desired shape, and the intended function of the finished product. This is abstract thinking made manifest in stone, perhaps our earliest evidence of minds that could plan not just for the immediate present, but for challenges yet to be encountered. But the Acheulean Revolution wasn't just about smarter thinking, it was about better living. These hand axes were the Swiss Army knives of the Pleistocene, versatile tools that could handle an enormous range of tasks. Need to butcher a large animal? The sharp edges and pointed tip made quick work of tough hides and joints. Digging for roots or tubers, the sturdy construction could penetrate hard-packed soil without breaking. Processing plant materials? The broad surfaces were perfect for crushing and scraping. For traveling groups, this versatility was invaluable. When your entire toolkit needs to be portable, having one tool that can handle dozens of different tasks makes the difference between success and failure. The archaeological evidence from butchery sites across Africa tells remarkable stories of these tools in action. At sites like Eurasia in Kenya, archaeologists have found hundreds of hand axes scattered around the remains of massive animals: elephants, hippos, giant baboons. The cut marks on these bones show systematic, skilled processing. Groups that knew exactly how to access the richest parts of a carcass with maximum efficiency. But here's what makes the Acheulean tradition truly extraordinary. It persisted, virtually unchanged, for over 1 million years. From its origins in Africa around 1.76 million years ago to sites like Safaka in Saudi Arabia as recently as 190,000 years ago, the basic design remained remarkably consistent. This wasn't technological stagnation, it was perfection. These early humans had discovered a solution so effective that it needed no improvement. The teaching and learning of Acheulean technology reveals sophisticated cultural transmission systems. Modern experiments using brain imaging show that learning to make hand axes activates the same neural networks involved in language processing and complex planning. This isn't coincidence. It suggests that the cognitive abilities required for advanced toolmaking and symbolic communication evolved together, each reinforcing the other. Imagine a master toolmaker instructing a young apprentice beside an ancient lake in Africa. The lesson involves not just physical demonstration but verbal instruction, gestural communication, and careful guidance of inexperienced hands. The student must learn to recognize good raw material, to read the stone's internal structure, to control force and angle with precision. This is education in its most fundamental form, the passing of survival knowledge from one generation to the next. But the Acheulean wasn't the only game in town. Even as hand axe technology spread across Africa and eventually into Eurasia, groups continued using simpler Oldowan toolkits when they served their purposes. The early migrants at Dmanisi carried only basic core and flake technologies, yet they successfully established populations thousands of miles from Africa. This suggests that technological sophistication, while advantageous, wasn't absolutely necessary for survival. Flexibility and adaptability mattered more than cutting-edge tools. The raw material strategies of these early toolmakers reveal sophisticated planning and landscape knowledge. At Eurasia, groups were transporting stone from at least 17 different sources, some many miles away. This wasn't random collection, it was systematic procurement based on detailed knowledge of where the best materials could be found. Different rocks served different purposes: hard, fine-grained stones for sharp cutting edges, tougher materials for heavy-duty chopping and digging. Tool maintenance and recycling became crucial skills for mobile groups. Hand axes could be resharpened repeatedly, their edges refreshed whenever they became dull. Broken implements could be recycled into different tool forms, ensuring that no valuable raw material was wasted. For people who might travel for days without encountering suitable stone sources, this kind of technological thriftiness was essential. The transport and caching of tools reveals planning capabilities that extend far beyond immediate needs. Groups would prepare tool blanks, partially worked pieces that could be quickly finished when needed, and carry them for miles. They established caches of raw materials and finished tools at strategic locations, creating supply networks that supported long-distance travel. Cultural traditions began emerging around tool-making practices. Different regions developed distinctive styles and techniques, subtle variations that marked the work of particular groups or traditions. These stylistic differences weren't just artistic preferences, they represented different solutions to similar problems, local innovations that reflected the accumulated wisdom of generations of toolmakers. The relationship between tools and social organization becomes clear when we consider the complexity of Acheulean production. Creating these implements required not just individual skill, but social stability, the kind of environment where masters had time to teach students, where knowledge could accumulate across generations, where innovation could be tested and refined through collective experience. Competition and cooperation shaped tool technology in complex ways. Groups with superior toolkits had advantages in processing food, crafting shelters, and defending themselves. But they also needed to share knowledge within their communities to maintain those advantages. The archaeological record suggests that successful groups found ways to balance technological secrecy with internal cooperation. Experimental archaeology, modern researchers learning to make and use ancient tools, has revealed the extraordinary effectiveness of these prehistoric implements. Properly made hand axes can butcher large animals more efficiently than many modern knives, dig through hard soil without breaking, and maintain sharp edges through intensive use. Our ancestors weren't making do with primitive substitutes, they were creating tools that excelled at their intended functions. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the sound of stone striking stone echoing across an ancient African landscape, the percussion of human ingenuity solving survival problems one careful blow at a time. Each hand axe represented hundreds of precise decisions, thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, and the unwavering belief that tomorrow's challenges could be met with today's preparation. The tools didn't just help humans survive, they helped create the kind of minds that could envision and achieve the impossible journey that lay ahead. Part 8. Competition and Coexistence. The year is 2023, and at Kubi Fora in northern Kenya, paleontologists Louise Leakey and Kevin Hatala are carefully documenting one of the most extraordinary discoveries in human evolution: footprints from two different hominin species, preserved side by side in the same ancient mud. The trackways tell a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about early human competition. Homo erectus and Paranthropus boisei, walking the same lakeshore within hours of each other, 1.5 million years ago. Picture this ancient scene unfolding on the shores of Lake Turkana. Two very different kinds of early humans are going about their daily business in overlapping territories. The robust Paranthropus individuals, built like linebacker versions of early humans, with massive jaw muscles and sagittal crests running along the tops of their skulls, are focused on processing tough plant foods. Their powerful teeth and specialized skull anatomy make them nature's food processors, capable of extracting nutrition from seeds, roots, and fibrous vegetation that would challenge other species. Meanwhile, the more lightly built Homo erectus groups are pursuing a different strategy entirely. Their smaller teeth and more generalized skull anatomy reflect a more omnivorous approach. They're the opportunists, the improvisers, equally comfortable scavenging meat from carnivore kills or gathering seasonal plant foods as opportunities arise. The footprint evidence reveals fascinating differences in how these species moved through the world. The Paranthropus tracks show a more ape-like gait, with slightly bent knees and a different foot structure that reflects their more conservative anatomy. The Homo erectus prints display the fully modern walking pattern we've come to associate with long-distance travelers, straight-legged strides and efficient foot mechanics perfectly adapted for covering ground. This coexistence wasn't unique to Africa. As Homo erectus spread across Eurasia, they encountered new forms of competition and cooperation. The remarkable site of Atapuerca in northern Spain preserves evidence of multiple hominin species sharing European landscapes by 1.2 million years ago. Though this comes after the initial erectus dispersal, it illustrates a pattern that likely characterized human evolution throughout the Pleistocene. The world was big enough for multiple experiments in being human. But coexistence didn't always mean peaceful coexistence. The bone deposits at Grandolina in Spain, dating to around 800,000 years ago, tell a darker story. Cut marks on hominin remains, the same kinds of marks found on butchered animal bones, provide unmistakable evidence of cannibalism among early Europeans. Whether this represents competition for resources, ritual behavior, or simple opportunistic scavenging remains debated, but it reminds us that early human interactions weren't always cooperative. The discovery, in 2025, of even earlier European fossils at Cima del Elefante, dating to 1.4 million years ago, has complicated our understanding of European colonization. These remains show a mixture of erectus-like and more archaic features, suggesting that the story of human dispersal was messier and more complex than simple linear migration might suggest. Multiple populations, perhaps representing different migration waves or local evolutionary developments, were experimenting with survival strategies across the European landscape. At Dmanisi, the evidence suggests a different model of survival through cooperation. The famous toothless elder, an individual who survived for years after losing most of his teeth, represents the kind of social solidarity that can overcome individual limitations. In a world without soft foods or sophisticated food processing, this individual's survival depended entirely on group care, pre-chewed food, protection from predators, assistance during travel. This level of social support wouldn't have been cheap for the group. Caring for non-productive members requires surplus resources and stable social bonds. Yet the Dmanisi groups chose to invest in this care, suggesting that they valued group cohesion and possibly the knowledge and experience that elders represented. In a world where survival information passed orally from generation to generation, losing an elder meant losing irreplaceable wisdom about landscapes, seasons, and survival strategies. The predator communities these early humans faced created intense competition for resources. At Dmanisi alone, paleontologists have identified 14 different carnivorous species, including saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, various bear species, and wild dogs. This represents one of the richest carnivore assemblages ever documented from the Pleistocene, suggesting an environment where competition for meat resources was particularly intense. Yet Homo erectus found ways to succeed in this competitive landscape. Their strategies seem to have emphasized flexibility and timing rather than direct confrontation. They learned to read the behavioral patterns of local predators, understanding when lions were most active, where hyenas typically denned, how to approach carcasses safely and efficiently. They became masters of the scavenging niche, not the primary predators, but the intelligent opportunists who could extract value from resources others overlooked or abandoned. Archaeological evidence suggests they also developed sophisticated sharing networks that reduced competitive pressure within groups. Rather than competing individually for limited resources, successful erectus populations seem to have developed protocols for distributing food, tools, and information that maximized group survival. This kind of reciprocal altruism, I help you today because I know you'll help me tomorrow, created social safety nets that buffered individuals against temporary setbacks. The question of violence between groups remains frustratingly difficult to address in the archaeological record. Skeletal trauma that might indicate interpersonal violence is documented in some Pleistocene specimens, but determining whether injuries resulted from accidents, predator attacks, or conflicts with other humans requires careful forensic analysis. The Dmanisi material shows some evidence of possible trauma, but interpretations remain debated among specialists. What seems clear is that successful erectus groups developed strategies that minimize direct competition while maximizing cooperative benefits. Their mobility allowed them to avoid resource conflicts by simply moving away from areas of intense competition. Their technological flexibility meant they could exploit different resource bases when primary targets became unavailable. Their social organization emphasized sharing and mutual support over individual accumulation. The ecological partitioning evident in the Kubifora footprints suggests that different hominin species could coexist by specializing in different aspects of the same environment. Robust forms focused on reliable but labor-intensive plant foods that required specialized processing. Erectus groups concentrated on more varied but less predictable resources that rewarded flexibility and mobility. This kind of resource partitioning is common in modern ecosystems, where closely related species avoid direct competition by occupying slightly different ecological niches. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine the complex social negotiations that must have occurred when different hominin groups encountered each other at water sources or rich feeding areas. These meetings could have involved sharing information about distant resources, establishing temporary alliances for protection against predators, or simply agreeing to peaceful coexistence in valuable locations. The lesson from these ancient encounters is profound. Success came not from dominating competitors, but from finding ways to coexist with them. In a world full of challenges, cooperation often proved more valuable than conflict. Part 9. Spreading across continents. In the remote Loess Plateau of northern China, archaeologist Zhao Yu Zhu kneels beside an ancient river terrace, carefully extracting stone tools from sediments that date to an almost impossible antiquity. The year is 2018, and the implements emerging from Shangqian are about to shatter our understanding of how quickly early humans spread across the world. These simple but unmistakable artifacts, cores, flakes, and scrapers, are 2.1 million years old, suggesting that humans reached East Asia far earlier than anyone had dared imagine. Picture the implications of this discovery. If these tools were indeed made by Homo erectus, and the evidence strongly suggests they were, then the journey from Africa to China happened with breathtaking speed. In less than 200,000 years, small groups of early humans had covered more than 8,000 miles, adapting to environments ranging from tropical savannas to temperate forests to the seasonal extremes of northern China. The Nihewan Basin, also in northern China, tells a complementary story of persistent occupation across deep time. Layer after layer of sediment preserves stone tools dating back at least 1.66 million years, evidence of groups that not only reached these distant lands, but thrived there across hundreds of thousands of years. This wasn't a single migration that barely survived. It was the establishment of robust populations that successfully adapted to one of the world's most challenging seasonal environments. The classic Chinese Homo erectus sites like Zhukudian, home of the famous Peking man fossils, document the long-term success of this adaptation. Dating to between 770,000 and 400,000 years ago, these remains show humans who had been living in northern China for over 1 million years by the time they died. Their skulls are robust and thick-walled, their faces broad and strong, their teeth worn down by decades of processing tough foods. These are the faces of survivors, people whose ancestors had been solving the problems of life in seasonal climates for countless generations. The question of fire control becomes crucial when considering survival in these northern latitudes. While definitive evidence remains elusive for the earliest periods, the advantages fire would provide in places where winter temperatures dropped well below freezing are obvious. Fire could mean the difference between life and death during the coldest months, providing not just warmth but the ability to extend useful daylight hours and process foods that would otherwise be inedible. Southeast Asia tells an equally remarkable story of human adaptability. The islands of Java preserve some of the most complete early human fossils outside of Africa, with sites like Sangiran and Trinil documenting Homo erectus populations that arrived over 1.3 million years ago. These tropical environments would have felt more familiar to African emigrants, but they presented their own unique challenges: dense forests, different prey species, new diseases, and the constant threat of volcanic activity. The journey to Java required crossing water barriers that would have challenged even experienced travelers. While sea levels were lower during glacial periods, creating the landmass known as Sunderland that connected many Southeast Asian islands to the mainland, reaching Java still demanded river crossings and possibly short ocean voyages. The presence of Erectus fossils on the island proves that these early humans possessed whatever skills, whether sophisticated raft building or simple swimming, were necessary to cross these barriers. The Mojokerto child and other early Javanese fossils suggest that Erectus groups established successful breeding populations on the island, not just occasional visitors who died trying to survive in unfamiliar territory. Children represent investment in the future, evidence of communities confident enough in their survival prospects to raise the next generation in new lands. Perhaps most remarkably, Homo erectus in Java persisted longer than anywhere else in the world. The Nandong site, with its collection of Erectus skulls found in river terrace deposits, has been reliably dated to between 117 and 108,000 years ago. These are among the youngest Erectus fossils known anywhere, representing populations that survived in Indonesian environments for over 1 million years, while their relatives elsewhere were being replaced by more modern human forms. Recent dating work at Ngandong has resolved decades of conflicting age estimates and confirmed that Erectus truly did persist in Southeast Asia far longer than previously believed. While modern humans were spreading across Africa and beginning to venture into the Middle East, small populations of these archaic humans were still living their traditional lives in the forests and river valleys of Java. The shell engravings from Trinil, possibly created by Homo erectus around 500,000 years ago, hint at cognitive abilities that go beyond simple tool-making and food processing. If these geometric patterns were indeed intentionally created, and the evidence, while debated, is compelling, They represent some of the earliest evidence for symbolic behavior in human evolution. These aren't complex artistic representations, but they suggest minds capable of abstract thinking and possibly aesthetic appreciation. The continental scope of Erectus distribution reveals a species that had truly mastered the art of long-distance travel and environmental adaptation. From the temperate forests of Georgia to the seasonal extremes of northern China to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, these early humans developed strategies that worked across an extraordinary range of conditions. What emerges from this continental perspective is a picture of human migration that was both more rapid and more successful than traditional models suggested. Rather than slow, gradual expansions taking hundreds of thousands of years, the evidence points to surprisingly quick dispersals that established viable populations across vast distances in relatively short periods. The key to this success seems to have been behavioral flexibility rather than technological sophistication. The tools found at sites across Eurasia are often simple and practical: cores, flakes, and occasional hand axes, but they were wielded by people who could adapt their strategies to whatever challenges local environments presented. Social learning networks likely played crucial roles in maintaining these far-flung populations. Groups that could share information about seasonal patterns, resource locations, and environmental hazards would have significant advantages over those operating in isolation. The archaeological evidence suggests that successful Erectus populations maintained cultural connections across considerable distances, sharing technological innovations and survival strategies that benefited the entire network. As you drift towards sleep, imagine standing on a hill in ancient China, looking out over landscapes that stretch beyond the horizon. Your ancestors made that journey from Africa to this place, walking thousands of miles through environments they had never seen, solving problems they had never encountered, but always moving forward with the confidence that whatever lay ahead could be mastered through persistence, cooperation, and ingenuity. They proved that the world isn't too big to explore, it's just big enough to make the journey worthwhile. Part 10. Legacy of the Great Migration. The last known Homo erectus died alone on a riverbank in Java 108,000 years ago, as modern humans were spreading across Africa and beginning to venture into new worlds of their own. This individual, whose skull would eventually be recovered from the Ngandong site by 20th century paleontologists, represented the end of one of the most successful chapters in human evolutionary history. For nearly 2 million years, Erectus had been the ultimate travelers, the species that proved humans could live anywhere on Earth. But their story didn't end with their extinction. It lived on in every step their successors would take. Picture the evolutionary inheritance that Homo erectus left for all humans who came after them. Their body plan, those long legs built for distance, that efficient, upright stride, became the template that carried our species to every continent. The anatomy that took them from African lakes to Chinese plains to Indonesian forests is the same anatomy that would eventually carry modern humans across the Bering Land Bridge, down the spine of the Americas, and across the Pacific to remote islands that Erectus never imagined. The technological traditions they pioneered echoed through hundreds of thousands of years of human innovation. The Acheulean hand axe, that masterpiece of early human engineering, provided the conceptual foundation for all the tools that followed. The idea of creating standardized, multi-purpose implements that could be carried anywhere and adapted to any task, this was Erectus thinking that survives in every Swiss Army knife, every modular tool system, every piece of equipment designed for versatility and portability. But perhaps their greatest legacy was something more intangible, the proof of concept for human adaptability itself. Before Erectus, no primate had ever successfully colonized multiple continents. No species had ever demonstrated that behavioral flexibility could overcome environmental barriers that seemed insurmountable. They didn't just migrate, they showed that migration was possible, that home could be anywhere humans decided to make it. The social learning systems that sustained Erectus populations across vast distances pioneered the cultural transmission mechanisms that would eventually give rise to complex human societies. The ability to share information across generations, to improve solutions over time, to maintain traditions across geographic barriers, these weren't just survival strategies, they were the foundations of civilization itself. Think about what this means for understanding human nature. The restlessness that drives modern humans to explore new places, to seek new experiences, to push beyond familiar boundaries, these aren't recent developments. They're ancient inheritances from ancestors who chose movement over security, exploration over stability, the unknown over the familiar. The cooperation that made Erectus survival possible in hostile environments established the template for human social organization. The groups that succeeded were those that shared resources, protected vulnerable members, and maintained solidarity even under extreme stress. The toothless elder at Dmanisi, cared for by his community long after he could contribute to group survival, represents an ethic of mutual support that became fundamental to human identity. The mastery of fire, achieved securely by Erectus populations at sites like Wonderwork Cave, gave humans control over one of nature's most powerful forces. This wasn't just about warmth and light, it was about the transformation of the human relationship with the natural world. Fire provided safety, extended useful hours, made inedible foods nutritious, and created social focal points where information could be shared and bonds could be strengthened. The long persistence of Erectus in places like Java, surviving over 1 million years in tropical environments while climate changed dramatically around them, demonstrated that human success doesn't require constant innovation. Sometimes the best strategy is to find solutions that work and stick with them across deep time. The tension between innovation and conservation, between embracing change and maintaining proven strategies, became a defining characteristic of human adaptation. Modern debates about human migration, climate adaptation, and cultural diversity all have their roots in the Erectus experience. They were the first humans to face the challenge of maintaining group identity while adapting to radically different environments. They pioneered the balance between cultural continuity and behavioral flexibility that would characterize all subsequent human expansions. The archaeological record they left behind continues to reshape our understanding of human capabilities. The Shangchen tools in China, if confirmed as Erectus work, suggest that early humans could move across continents far more rapidly than anyone had imagined. The shell engravings from Java hint at aesthetic sensibilities and symbolic thinking that emerge much earlier in human evolution than traditional models predicted. Their extinction reminds us that even the most successful adaptations eventually face challenges they cannot overcome. Climate change, competition from more advanced human populations, genetic isolation, environmental degradation, the factors that eventually led to Erectus extinction, continue to influence human survival today. Their story is both inspiration and warning. Adaptability is powerful, but it has limits. Yet their ultimate legacy lies in the simple fact that they made human global expansion not just possible but inevitable. By proving that humans could survive anywhere, they established the precedent that everywhere was potential human habitat. Every subsequent human migration, from the Neanderthal expansion into Europe to the modern human colonization of Australia to the eventual settlement of the Americas, was built on foundations that Erectus had laid. The mental maps they created, the route-finding skills they developed, the environmental assessment techniques they pioneered, all became part of the inherited toolkit that later humans would use to complete the colonization of Earth. They were the advanced scouts for our entire species, the pathfinders who marked the trails that everyone else would follow. When modern humans finally reached the same landscapes that Erectus had inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years, the river valleys of China, the tropical forests of Java, the temperate woodlands of Georgia, they weren't entering empty territory. They were walking paths that had been traveled for nearly 2 million years by ancestors who had faced the same challenges, solved the same problems, and proved that human ingenuity could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember that the bed you lie in, the room that shelters you, the city that surrounds you, all exist because 1.8 million years ago, a small group of early humans looked beyond the horizon and decided to keep walking. They had no idea they were changing the course of history. They were just following their feet and their curiosity, trusting in their ability to adapt to whatever came next. The story kept going, because we did. We are their legacy, their dreams made manifest, their impossible journey completed. Every step we take carries forward the momentum they began on ancient African shores. Every challenge we face is met with tools they first imagined, strategies they first developed, courage they first demonstrated. The scar became the starting line, the journey became home. The wanderers became us.